Hi, welcome back to Ask a Creationist. I'm Todd Wood. I'm president of Core Academy of Science. I'm a young age creationist. I'm here to answer your questions about science, faith, creation, evolution, origins, whatever you got. We're interested in hearing from you. Let us know what your question is, and maybe we'll feature it on a future episode. And do remember to leave a like on this video and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to get notifications when we put up new episodes. Today's question is, it's 3 days before the sun. Plants without the sun. How can the days of creation be taken literally? You can't be serious. It doesn't make any sense. You can't create plants without sunlight. They can't live without sunlight. And you can't even have days if you don't have a sun. It doesn't make sense. And of course, this is referring to day 4 of creation. This is literally the 16th verse of creation week in Genesis 1. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. So this is the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. It is taking place after the earth has been created, after there is a day-night cycle going on in the earth without a sun. And it's taking place after the dry land and plants have appeared. So how does this make any sense at all? Now, this is a question I hear a lot. I think some people are really genuinely serious about it. I have to question whether others are, because it doesn't strike me as a very interesting, meaningful question. What do I mean by that? Well, yeah, the plants originate on day 3. 24 hours later, God makes the sun. It's 24 measly hours. There's no plant's going to die from lack of sunlight in 24 measly hours. It's just not how plant physiology works. It's silly. And there's already light. The text of Scripture already describes the light going on. Whatever the light is, there's light. So the plants are not in any danger of missing out on anything because the sun is created a measly day later. So for some people, I think, you just sort of need to chill out a little bit, because that's really not a very clever or a very impressive argument against the days of creation. All right, smart guy, what about the days before the sun, though? Surely that makes a lot of sense, right? Because we know what makes the day-night cycle on the planet. First, you have a planet, right? Like ours, and it's rotating about an axis. And as it rotates, it's rotating through space. And over here, we have the sun, and the sun is shining on one side of the planet only. And so the other side of the planet is in the dark, and we call that night. And the lit up side of the planet is in the sunlight, and that's when it's day. And so if you don't have a sun, you can't have daylight, and it just doesn't make any sense. Does it? Or does it? Well, to me, the obvious question is, well, what is the source of light, right? The text says there's light. God said, let there be light, and there was light. All right, well, maybe, you just don't need a sun. Maybe you just need some other light, like some sort of mega divine flashlight. I don't know. It doesn't matter what it is. It's a source of light, and that source of light is directional from one side of the earth and not on the other side of the earth. It's not really that difficult to imagine a rotating planet with some sort of light source on one side, very bright light source, producing a day-night cycle without what we think of as the sun. So again, this one's a little meatier, but I just don't see it as being some shockingly horrible, unanswerable question. Zinger, I gotcha. You creationists can't answer this. Yeah, we can. And it's really not that impressive. All right, well, that's the silly version of these questions. But I do think there's a better argument. It's actually a much more difficult argument to respond to. And in the interest of fairness, I think I'd rather talk about that argument a little more. Yes, maybe you've been very excited about the days before the sun or the plants before the sun. How could this be? And I think it's easily dispensed with. It's not that difficult. But the better argument, this is one I don't hear very often. At least I don't hear it articulated very well. So let me see if I can articulate it for you. Mythology, particularly the myths of the ancient Near East, often display a kind of apathy toward the literal truth of the stories they're telling, or at the very least display an apathy towards explaining all the piddly little details of the story that's being told. Right? So let me give you an example from, clear mythology. The Enuma Elish. This is a creation story that was found in ancient Mesopotamia. It was common. The original version was written in Akkadian. Later, they found an Assyrian version that substitutes out the main god Marduk for the Assyrian god Ashur. And so this went around, and in the story, we have the story of Marduk creating the world and the cosmos from the body of Tiamat, which was a dragon god that he vanquished. And before the world's created, the god Marduk is equipped with weapons. He's given a sword, he's given a mace, he's given bow and arrows. And these are the things that he uses to defeat Tiamat. And then he also has a net that he uses to capture the gods that were on Tiamat's side. And you also see, before the creation of the cosmos, the gods eating food, and Marduk wears armor, and there's clothing. And so you sort of think, all right, well, how does that make any sense that they're doing all these things before the creation of the cosmos? And of course, I suppose an ancient Mesopotamian would say, well, these are divine weapons and divine clothes and divine food that are not part of this created realm. And I could imagine that. But at the same time, that's not really spelled out in the myth, is it? The myth just says that this stuff happens. You just sort of assume that is what happened, and you take it to be correct, sort of, I guess. So thinking through this mythology, then, you sort of come away thinking that the days of creation are sort of displaying this same antipathy, this same indifference towards explaining all the piddly details as mythology does. But then that raises the question of, well, what sort of two questions? Let's take it that way. The first question would be, how would the ancients have understood their mythology? Now, I've heard lots of people, modern people, tell us, well, they clearly took it literally. They believe these to be literally true, that, the world, the ground that we walk on is the body of Tiamat, and that the sky is another part of the body of Tiamat, and so forth. And that this was literally true. And then some people even go so far as to say, ancient, what I would perceive as figures of speech, like, the bowels of mercy, that this is a statement of physiology, that this is where emotions come from. They come from the intestines. And I think there's a certain point at which I just find it all to be quite absurd and silly, and it's just not possible. Or at the very least, I would think it's very condescending of us to think that the ancients did not understand the kind of nitpicking questions that we put to the texts, or that they don't understand how to use figures of speech. I just find that silly and unlikely. So to say that the ancients would have looked at a myth like Enuma Elish and interpreted it all perfectly literally, I'm not sure that's right. Now, the second question I think that it brings up, how should we read the Bible? Especially how should we read the Bible given this penchant for indifference towards spelling out all the answers, sort of leaving us to reason through things and come up with answers on our own. And yes, there are people out there who think the Bible ought to be read very, very literally as you could possibly read it. And I tend to think that's not always how best to read the scripture, or at least that's just one way of reading scripture, and that there are other ways of reading scripture. So I don't have a really good answer to this argument, except that I would just say it doesn't strike me as very conclusive. Just because an author is not interested in spelling out all the useless piddly details of the story that they're telling doesn't mean that it's a myth or not a myth. It just means that the author does not care about the silly things that you care about. And I think that's quite reasonable. But it still does leave us with the question of, should we read Genesis 1 as mythology, or should we read it as history? And my answer is that I think it's probably to be understood as history. And I would say that based on other passages of scripture and my understanding that the Bible is not merely an ancient piece of literature, but is the divine revelation of God, which elevates it beyond just the Enuma Elish or, other fanciful stories of the ancient Near East. Now, I don't want to leave you hanging with that, let's talk about a more interesting question to me, and that is, why are the creation days arranged the way they are? Why is it that the sun and the moon and the stars are created on day 4 and not at the beginning of the cosmic creation? Why wouldn't God have made the sun and the stars first and then put the earth in orbit around the sun and then created things on the earth? Isn't that a more sensible way to go? At least that's not the way it is, right? So maybe I'm wrong. Well, I think one thing that we need to think about is that in ancient Near Eastern culture, people worshiped the sun. The sun was viewed as a divine god, oftentimes a very important member of the divine pantheon of gods. And so here in Genesis, we have a passage where we have the creation of the sun. It is entirely created at the command of God. God does it. There is no other God. God's not killing another god in order to create the sun. God's not having sex with some goddess in order to produce the offspring who is the sun. No, the sun is a thing that God made. And it's not even named. They don't even give it a name here, which is really interesting because a lot of the other things that God creates, he names, but not the sun. And it's not even important enough to show up on day 1 or even day 2. It's down here on day 4. So it's sort of a lesser important thing. And I think that helps us to understand at least one reason why there might be this particular order in the days of creation. Again, though, that doesn't help us tell whether it's history or not, right? Because it could be that God did it that way so that it could be recorded and then show that the sun is not all powerful and divine. Or it could be that the myth was written that way in order to communicate this idea. Either way you go, it works in either scenario, which I think is really interesting. Now, again, I want to emphasize here, just because this argument works any way you go doesn't mean that I don't think that the passage of Genesis 1 is historical. I do think that. And I do think this is how God made it. And in fact, I think it's more powerful that God did it this way than it would be than if somebody just made up a story about it, which is, I think, quite less interesting. All right. Well, thanks for listening to this episode and watching. Check us out at coursesci.org/connect. You'll find links there to all of our important stuff, including other outputs of Core Academy, like Let's Talk Creation, our podcast, and my Patreon research reports. You will also find ways there to help support us financially. If you've enjoyed this series, please do consider making a contribution so that we can continue it. And don't forget again to leave a like if you've enjoyed this video. If you haven't enjoyed this video, leave a like anyway. Click that subscribe button. Click that bell for notifications when we put up new content. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.